This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. And for our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. In this episode of The Biggest Table, I welcome Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter to discuss the intricate connections between food, identity, and justice. Dr. Carter, an expert in Black, womanist, and environmental ethics, shares insights from his upbringing in Michigan, where food insecurity during his childhood shaped his understanding of food's importance. We delve into Dr. Carter's book, The Spirit of Soul Food, which explores ancestral food traditions and the concept of Black veganism. Highlighting the intersectionality of race, food, and non-human animals, Dr. Carter argues for ethical eating practices that honor sacred worth and oppose oppressive systems like factory farming. He emphasizes the importance of context-specific and agent-specific actions in aligning one's diet with ethical and spiritual values. Dr. Carter also calls for systemic changes and personal compassion in the pursuit of justice for both human and non-human communities. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I'm your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm joined by Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter. Christopher's research, teaching, and activist interests are in Black, womanist, and environmental ethics, with a particular focus on race, food, and non-human animals. His publications include Race, Animals as a New Vision of the Beloved Community in Animals and Religion, The Spirit of Soul Food, and Blood in the Soil, the Racial, Racist, and Religious Dimensions of Environmentalism in the Bloomsbury Handbook on Religion and Nature. In them, he explores the intersectional oppressions experienced by people of color, non-human nature, and animals. Currently, he is an associate professor of theology, ecology, and race at Methodist Theological School in Ohio, lead pastor of the Loft at Westwood United Methodist Church, and he is also on the board of directors of Farm Forward, an anti-factory farming nonprofit. He is married to Dr. Gabrielle Carter, a small animal veterinarian oncologist, and while their son Isaiah is not a doctor of any sort, he definitely believes he is more intelligent than his parents. So thanks for joining me today, Christopher. It's great to connect. Really enjoyed your book, The Spirit of Soul Food. I'm excited to discuss it in ways that my audience and all of us can learn from you.
Oh, no, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to, talk about one of the most interesting things I would say that I've realized as a writer is how many people, after they finish a project, are kind of over it. And they're like, I don't want to do anything with it. That hasn't been my experience. I think I'm hopeful that I've sold enough copies that I get a chance to do a second edition. I think I'm pretty close because there's definitely more to say. In these podcasts and these kind of conversations have helped me realize and learn more about what I would include that I didn't include in the first version.
Awesome. So as we get started, I'm curious, what role did food play in your upbringing, and how did the table function in who you are today?
It's kind of complicated, I guess, in a certain way. So I'm originally from Michigan, so I grew up in a family of people whose jobs were tied to the auto industry. Reaganomics really decimated my home state, in the 80s and 90s. And so I went from having a mother and a stepfather who were financially secure, who worked for the automobile industry, to being laid off, to just, by the time I was 7 years old, my dad, who really struggled with joblessness, right, and not being able to provide for his family, went through a depression and started using drugs and ended up having to go to rehab and went to jail. And so it's my mom, and I'm the oldest of, at that time, 3 of us. And so we were really food insecure, from the time I was about 7 to 12. Most of my meals were at school, and we had food at home. It was often food from the food bank, and because my mom was usually working 2 jobs, most of the time when I ate, it was just me and my sister and my brother. And so, yeah, times were not easy. I think I always try to look back at those times and have a spirit of gratefulness, because even though there were definitely times I went to bed hungry, like, I'm fully aware that could have been worse. There are
Mm.
people who had even less than me. I'm grateful for public school food programs, probably more so than most,
Yeah.
because of my own experience of realizing how important they are. Um, and at the same time, all this stuff is happening. We lived at that time up until I think we moved to Indiana when my parents had their job stuff. We moved back to Michigan by the time I started junior high, late elementary, junior high. And my dad's out of rehab. My parents are back together. Finances are a little bit better. We're still poor, but we can eat. We start spending more time with my grandfather, and my grandparents lived in the country. They lived like
Mm.
I lived in the city, lived in this country,
Yeah.
and he had this garden that really was like, I mean, honestly, it's like a homestead, but in his mind, it's a garden, right?
Right.
And so he's the one that I really would say I began to learn and appreciate about the nuances of growing food, because
Mm.
he was a migrant picker. So he was born in Mississippi in 1938, didn't really go to elementary school, just worked in the fields, like literally picking cotton, picking
Wow.
berries, just anything. If you read slave narratives, right,
Yeah.
like that's what he was doing still
Wow.
in the 40s.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think learned to appreciate all the stuff that's tied into growing food and eating real food. and
Hmm.
and and I don't even think I understood at the time what that was, right? So I'm in my teenage years eating food that is what we would now call organic, but I
Yeah.
didn't have a word for that. It was just like regular food.
Right.
And so that's kind of where I would say it began, really began
Mm.
to think more about and appreciate access to food, and food that was cooked and food that tasted good. And I didn't start thinking critically about it until I was in my late 20s, but I would say formatively, it was being food insecure and spending time in the summers with my grandpa, helping him in his garden, is kind of what kind of gave me the foundation for thinking theologically and critically about food.
Wow. No, that's awesome that you had those two experiences, because they're very, dy- um, they're very different in a lot,
Yes.
and um, in your preface of The Spirit of Soul Food, you write, our foodways are an expression of our identity, a way of maintaining connections to our ancestors and our ancestral homelands. Our foodways are personal and communal, emotional and habitual. And so, as you reflect on your experience, plus, as you've thought about the African American experience of food, like, how does that, like, explain and unpack that for my listeners? Just because we don't think of that, our foodways, as ancestral and communal. We think of it very individual, or my food choices are individual choices I make, but with no connection to the past.
Yeah, I think people, they believe they think that, but they actually
Yeah.
don't.
Right. No.
I think that's what they believe. So, for example, one of the idea for even that sentence, I remember writing that it came up for me reflecting on my time in graduate school, and being in California, so far away from home, going to predominantly white institution as
Mm.
most graduate schools are,
Yeah.
and feeling really disconnected from my community.
Mm.
And back home, which was not predominantly white, and realizing that what made me feel most like myself and grounded was when I would eat the things that I ate growing up, right?
Mm.
When I would cook red beans and rice, or when I would make collard greens, or any of those kinds of things. That's what made me feel like I was connected to home, because I couldn't afford to go home, right? Like, I
Right.
literally just couldn't afford to go. I mean, graduate school, most graduate students
No.
don't have the money.
Yeah. Right. Yep.
And so that's what kind of laid the foundation for that claim, is that there's a way in which eating those foods allowed me to feel a part of something larger than myself. It
Mm.
reminded me that this way of eating, that these things I was eating, that the way I eat rice and the way I eat beans and how I cook them, how I season them, all these things were passed down to my ancestors, and they live within me, and I'm a manifestation of that.
Mm.
And what I would do when I began teaching, right? So when I'm teaching at the University of San Diego, teaching undergrad at this time, I'd have my students write, one of their projects was on a food dish that was meaningful for them. And so often they would talk about something they had from their childhood, something their parents or their grandparents made from them. And it wasn't about the food in terms of what it tasted like per se, as much as it was about the memory. Right? Like it was about the memory of like what that came from and why they ate that and what they did on this particular occasion and what it meant for them. And so allowing them to soak in that memory, right?
Yeah.
To like really sit in that and be like, this is what's meaningful about this dish. It's not just that it's like the food that's on a plate, it's all the stuff that goes along with it. That's what gives it its full flavor, that full embodiedness to you. And so allowing people to make that connection is why I would say, like, we all are connected to our ancestors through our foods. We just don't think like that. Like we're not we don't contemplate, right, over what it is we're eating to make that broader connection that I'm trying to draw when I write that sentence.
No. Yeah, because there was a sentence that stuck out that eating is a contemplative act. That we are connected to our past, and our food does tell a story. And I think as I've done this podcast, and listeners, as you've listened, I'm sure you remember this theme coming up of just the stories that are associated with the food. And I think from Blacks and people of color, it comes up more so than, say, with my Caucasian guests. And I've had the privilege of talking to Michael Twitty and his, history and what his food means to him, and other people. And so, yeah, I think I love that project you did with your students at University of San Diego. And listeners, if you're thinking about it, I would just even pause the podcast right now and think about what a dish of yours that might hold that special memory, and what did it signify? Who's there with you? Because like Christopher said, we are connected. And so how do we remember that and recall that to mind? I think is so important.
Speaking of Michael, that's one thing I want to say, like, because for those, I'm sure your listeners know Michael is Jewish.
Yeah.
And I've gotten a chance, a few occasions to speak to Jonathan Foer, writer who's also Jewish. And so in his book, Eating Animals, he tells a story about his grandmother and why she was so concerned about what they ate was because she's a Holocaust survivor.
Right.
And I had the same experience actually with a student in one of my classes whose great grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, but his grandmother had this dish that she prepared that she learned from her mom, and same kind of memory was wrapped up in their eating. And so I have them do this project where they tell this food narrative is what this project is called. It's actually, they have them record a video and do it with someone, like with their parent or whoever they're telling the story about. And so as one of my students is talking to his mom about this toast and like this kosher dish, it's like toast and eggs and stuff like that. It's really cheap stuff, but it's more about, again, how they make it in the story that's around it. They both start crying. Like they both hadn't went into it feeling emotional, but as they start telling the story around why this dish is important to their family and why kashrut is important to their family, why they eat this way, it connected with them. And again, like I said, it connects them to their ancestral past, that it is about taking that time to pause and recognizing that eating can and ought be a contemplative act. Sometimes we're in a rush and you're driving, you gotta do what you gotta do.
Right.
But you're every couple of days, man, take the time to just slow down, and just really think about what you're eating. And it will change how you eat. It changes what you think about what you put in your body and your relationship with food, in my experience.
Right. Yeah. Because, what I appreciate about your book is just the trauma that can be associated too with our food memories, and you talk about, and I can't remember if it was in the Spirit of Soul Food or an article where, that you've run into some young Black people that are hesitant to get into farming or gardening because of its association with slavery. And so as you've thought about soul food, like how is it tied to slavery? And, how have you untangled that trauma in your own life to become who you are today?
It's been difficult, soul food. I believe soul food is actually a manifestation of like Black resistance to like white supremacy.
Yeah.
Like it's a way for us to have agency over what we put in our bodies, to name it and claim it, and to also make it taste good,
Yep.
and to find a way to feed ourselves that connects us to the foods that our ancestors in West Africa ate. Um, and I think that the emergence of soul food, the language of soul food, started in like the 60s. And it really was a way for people, Black Northerners, to reconnect with their Southern roots. And so there was always this idea of nostalgia and reconnecting to an idea of what our ancestors ate for so many people. And because of that, because the reason why so many of us are here is because of enslavement, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have a mixed ancestry, which I talk about in the book. So that's a part of my story. It's not the entirety of my story. Um, I think that the reality of wrestling with the fact that um, our diet is tied, to an extent, the idea of our diet is tied to enslavement, is difficult. And some people get stuck in that space of only seeing it as slave food and
Mm-hmm.
saying this is an homage to my ancestors. And what I try to do in the book is argue that slavery is a part, but it's not the part of our story, right?
Right.
That's what I told those kids that you mentioned. That's what I tell people who still really struggle with um, doing any kind of agricultural work or thinking about it that way, is that part of the reason we were enslaved, the primary reason we were enslaved, is because of our agricultural skill. Like
Yeah.
it wasn't like we have this myth that we were enslaved because of like, oh, we were strong, and while that's true, it was because we knew how to grow foods that Europeans struggled to figure out how to cultivate as well as we could here. And so I have source literature that I cite in the book that talks about how there was like how these people were, I would argue, doing capitalism well. Like they would say, oh, you're going to grow, you're in the Carolinas and you're growing rice. Well, you want to buy an African from the Senegambia region because these are rice growing people. And so
Right.
they already know how to do the work you're going to have them do. I mean, that's
Hmm.
just like, that's common sense, right?
Yeah.
But we don't think about humans in that way. And that's because we're
Yeah.
not evil.
Yeah.
And so, but that's what they were doing. And
Hmm.
that's why many of us were enslaved. And so what I try to impress upon people is a way to try to take some pride in that, to not
Hmm.
just get stuck in the fact that of enslavement, but also think about farming as a way to tell our story before enslavement and a way for us to continue our story after, right? Through a
Hmm.
process of liberation. And that takes tending to,
Right.
I mean, for all of us who've been through any kind of religious or spiritual trauma, you have to turn inward and deal with those reactive parts. And for me, I think actually getting back into the land and growing food, telling these stories was a big part of that healing process, right? Like
Hmm.
it was really about, yeah, I would say storytelling and growing food and eating were a
Right.
big part of how I began to heal from it.
To sort of get to these underlying themes, coloniality is the underlying theme of the spirit of soul food. Um, can for our listeners, can you explain? Help us begin to unpack, like as we think about our foodways and sort of the racist underpinnings of it. Like, help us understand how coloniality has wreaked havoc on everything.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to put it. So in theological terms, well, actually, let me step back before I say theological terms. Let me define what I'm talking about when I'm saying colonialism or coloniality. Probably the easiest way to think about it is right now we live in a world, broadly speaking, especially if you live in America, where our lives are centered around serving institutions.
Mm.
And I think the beloved community, the community that you see Jesus trying to create, the community that prophets and activists like Martin Luther King argued for, was the inverse. It's where institutions are at the service of life, right?
Mm.
We actually create institutions to help us actually live more flourishing and better lives. And that's just, again, we live in the exact opposite world right now,
Mm.
where we are called, where we are driven by our work schedules or driven by our calendars, in institutions that we fund and create with our tax dollars aren't often at our best interests. And this is
Mm.
regardless of where you're on the political spectrum, right?
Right.
So people will say, oh, I'm conservative, I'm for small government, I'm for people being able to take care of themselves. Well, then within those communities, you still lack the infrastructure to be able to do that, because economically you don't have the capital to actually take care of yourself.
Right.
Right. And then you find yourself needing healthcare or
Yep.
whatever, and you don't have access to it. And then you have people who don't spend their money wisely, or who invest in infrastructure that actually isn't to the benefit of the community. And so, broadly speaking, colonialism is a way to de-link sacred worth from life. Like literally is a way to look at life as not having sacred value. So again, theologically, what I'm arguing for is to take seriously, the first and second creation narratives, right? We know these are our stories that give us an idea of the value and sanctity of life. That we're creating God's image, that matters, that God created life, and that matters, and we're called to be stewards. And what does that mean if we actually embody that and practice it, rather than seeing human beings or seeing non-human nature as commodities that can be controlled and that ought to be sold in more or less in ways that actually benefit corporations. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about colonialism.
Yeah.
And that is the logic that is used to justify the exploitation of non-human nature, of people of color, of women, right? Like it's all about this idea that these things, that we become a thing that has less value, right? Or our value is only measured by how we contribute to this, the creation of wealth for someone else. And so I'm trying to unsettle and disrupt that and recognize that, Andrew, regardless of how you feel about God, right? God loves you.
Yeah.
Like, regardless of how you feel. And so it's trying to get people to get that in their heads. I'm like, no, you have sacred worth. Even if you don't believe in God, regardless of what you believe, God loves you. And that matters. Now it matters to how we treat each other and recognizing that we are beloved. And that, I think, more than anything, probably has radicalized me.
Right.
And seeing the sacred worth in people that I don't even like has made me a much more compassionate person, and has radicalized me to want to make sure that everybody feels as though that they have what they need to live a flourishing life.
Right. And what I think separates your work from others that I've read, from like Adrian Miller and talked to, and Michael Twitty, is your push to us to see not just the sacredness in humans, but sort of the sacredness and the beloved nature of non-human nature and animals, and that it should inform our food ways. Can you say a little more about that? Just because I think that is so distinctive and where I was challenged most by your work.
Yeah, this is where, Michael and I have only had a few conversations, but this is definitely where we diverge. And I think, it started with my ability to connect the oppression of my grandfather to the oppression of non-human nature, non-human animals. And so when I was growing up and when I was a teenager, we would go down to Mississippi for our family reunion. My grandpa grew up in a community called Brookhaven, Mississippi. And so when we would drive, and my grandpa's introverted, I should say, like, he doesn't really talk a whole lot. We would drive down to Mississippi, and that's when he would start telling stories. Like once we got past Chicago, and started getting more into the South, he would talk about picking cotton and picking berries and all this stuff he had to experience growing up. And he went through so much racist dehumanization. He talks about the names that he was called and how he understood himself and how he had to understand himself as having value beyond the labels that were placed upon him. And so I kind of had this in the back of my mind growing up, that people used animals and the animalization of Black people as a way to justify dehumanization, right? As a way to justify enslavement and exploitation. I hadn't really made the connection to the point where I was going to stop eating animals at that point, but it was the seeds were planted. And it wasn't until graduate school when I began to think more critically about it. And then honestly, it was through seeing Latinx, Latino farm workers, like going through and dealing with the same kind of exploitation that my grandpa did. And reading how the people who own these farms, or really not the landowners, people who manage the people, how they talked about them. Again, they justify this kind of exploitation by thinking of these people as less than human, by calling them animals. And that connection, the logics of race are tied to the connection of animality. Like that's what I argue in the book. Like
Yeah.
they are tied together.
Right.
The only way you can the only way it makes sense to you theologically as a Christian to say, well, I can enslave this person and I'm doing something good for their soul, is to say, well, this person really isn't a person. I'm actually helping them become a person
Right.
by enslaving them. That's the lie they have to tell themselves
Yeah.
for them to get over the fact that they were doing that. And in so doing, it really cemented this link between dehumanization and racialization and animalization. Like all these things are deeply interconnected. And so for me, if I'm going to fight for liberation, if I'm going to fight for what I would call like a decolonization, so anti-oppression,
Right.
I have to get at the root cause of this. The root cause of white supremacy, the root cause of colonialism is this oppressive hierarchy that places value not in what you can produce, right, rather than who you are as a person. And so I see that rather than fighting for, I would argue, a lot of people fight for equality with the oppressor. They're fighting to be a part of a system where they aren't oppressed, but they recognize that that's other things can be exploited. I'm fighting for the dismantling of all of that, right? And I believe within the fiber of my beings that this is the way, that is the way of Jesus. Like when I read the Gospels and I see this and I see the ways in which the exploitation of non-human nature and exploitation of animals directly impacts the people in my community, right? Factory farms, the people who work in those are predominantly Black and brown. Where are they located? In Black and brown communities. Like the ecological impacts Black and brown people. Like it's all right there. And so as a Black person, I don't want to be complicit in their suffering, right? If I want to argue for their freedom and their liberation, I ought to do everything that I'm capable of, right? And for me, that capacity is built into my veganism, right? I'm capable of, not everybody's capable of practicing it, or they can't practice it in the way that I do. And that's kind of why I created a different version of veganism. But it's the same kind of, for me, it's like, my favorite, and I know you said I'm Reverend Dr. Carter, so people probably have caught on to the fact that I use a lot of scripture and it gets a little preachy. But for me, I love the book of James. And part of the reason I love the book of James is because James, the writer of James, is like, don't be a seer of the word who isn't also a doer of the word, right? Don't deceive yourselves by what you say. Like, actually look at what you do. And so for me, it is about action. It's about allowing your faith to move you to compassionate actions. And for me, one of the most concrete actions is to not participate in the logics of dehumanization, into the logics of animalization. And I feel like that's being morally consistent. And that's what I'm trying to do. And that's why I make that connection. Because I think every person of color knows that racism is tied to animalization, because we've all been called an animal name.
Wow.
We all know somebody. I mean, it's just that happens.
Yeah.
And so you learn that pretty young, and you set it aside because, again, we all participate in it. And so you think, well, it's just normal and that's what people do.
Wow. There was a lot there. Like, I feel like I'm going to need to re-listen to this multiple times just to grasp it. And so listeners, I hope you caught some glimpses, and I love your, preach all you want, Reverend, like, but really what it is tied to is you, in your book makes clear, is that you want to dismantle colonialism because you want to see the flourishing of all creation. And because if Jesus came to set the world right, that means everything, living, non-living, is set to flourish. And that's God's vision from the very beginning. Like you said, like, your work is tied to the creation narratives that we were designed, I forget exactly how you put it, but we were to tend and to take care of, and to, there's a gentle care, and so if Jesus came to set the world right, like, that's not just humanity, but it's all of the ways that lead to the dehumanization, everything, of all of nature. And that's where it's tough, right? Because that means we have to make choices consistent in light of who we believe Jesus is and what we believe his kingdom is about. And I have to wrestle with your book. Like, I have to be like, okay, like, he's pushing me. Christopher's pushing me to ask some questions, you know, and it's good, right? That's what books should do, right? Like it's easy to read a book I agree with and then just, underline a few sentences and feel good about myself. It's another thing to read a book that's asking me to completely change a way of being in the world. And that's your book. And so for our listeners, like in light of coloniality, in light of Jesus's coming and desire to see the flourishing of everything, like how should we think about food?
Well, that's a great question. And I think before I answer it, I want to make sure that I'm sure people listening to this and they're like, I'm an ethicist. So I'm always thinking like, okay, people are probably thinking of multiple arguments against what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so I want to be clear. I come from a family of people who were hunters. Again, as I said, I'm from Michigan. That's kind of, a lot of people live there. That's kind of what we do. And my grandpa, again, growing up where he grew up, I mean, he grew most of his own food and didn't eat a lot of meat growing up because he was poor. So we never were a huge meat eating family. But for me, I probably have less. I'm really opposed to factory farming at its core.
Right.
If you're from a family who lives, like we have a friend of ours lives in Montana, they don't buy any factory farm meat. Like everything that they do is what they have, what they grow, and what he hunts. I don't really have too much of a problem with that. I'm like, if that's what, because if you actually talk to people who hunt, many of them, not all, but many of them have a deep connection to what it is they're doing.
Right.
Like they understand the sanctity of life, like because they have to deal with the death. They see it, right? And that changes. Like if you know anybody that's if you have any people in your family who's a veteran that have had to experience death, it changes you. Whether it's a human or non-human animal, it changes you. And so for those folks who are doing that work, who are actually cultivating a space of reciprocity where they understand the value of life and death, broadly speaking, I know that I feel as though they're practicing their faith in a way that does value and honor God's creation, because we are created to be stewards of the land, and we do have to, as a species, the only way we evolved as we have is eating meat. So I don't want to pretend that that's not the case.
Right.
What I do want to make clear is both the way in which the vast majority of us consume animal products through factory farming. There is nothing sacred about that.
No.
This is a terrible practice that needs to be, that we need to opt out of. Right. And so first and foremost, that's what I am critiquing. Systems that exploit. Most, again, I say most, and I would say the majority, most hunters don't hunt for sport and for exploitation. They hunt because that's how they feed their families.
Yeah.
And so for me, when I think about what a future of food can look like, in light of our faith commitments, it is trying to create foodways that can be at the service of life. And it's really about both a local aspect, which I'm sure people have already listened to your podcast are thinking about.
Yeah.
It's local foods, but it's also participating in like what I would call like actually supporting organizations that help, that really work directly with farmers, right? I think often we get too wrapped up in local rather than thinking like, well, local means maybe my community, but there may be a little bit farther out. You actually can work directly with like farmers. Like, so I buy from a co-op that gets from things from what I would call local farmers within a certain mile radius. That's been really fruitful for me, right? In terms of my community. And again, I live in Los Angeles. It's a bit, I mean, when we're not on fire, it's a bit of a privilege because the growing season here is like forever, right?
Yeah.
So there isn't a lot of things I don't have access to, but I do eat within the seasons. Like I do those kinds of things and limit what I eat because I know this would have had to have a larger carbon footprint.
Right.
So, so for me, it's about the way to eat in alignment with the values that I have is what I call soulful eating. And so this is practicing a kind of what I call Black veganism. And I know we'll come to that in a minute. So that's eating in a way that's very conscious of the environment and the people who grow the food. It is making sure that we're promoting justice for the earth. So eating in ways that have the least carbon intensive as possible. So for some of us, maybe you have a gift of the green thumb and you can actually grow some of your own food. But more than anything, maybe you actually can encourage your religious community to participate in growing food, right? And so in Michigan, I have, especially in Michigan, but also back east, There's a friend of mine, Heber Brown, who's in charge of the Black Church Food Security Network in New York City. These churches that use their land to grow food, right? And that's like, rather than having grass, you actually can grow food, or your church can be a food hub, right? That's what our church does, because we're concrete. Like we can't grow anything, right?
Yeah.
And so, but we are a hub for people to come and get food, right? And everything we do, we don't make any money on. We're just breaking even.
Yeah.
And so it's really trying to meet people where they are and give them the capacity to do some work without feeling the kind of shame and guilt that I think is often induced when we talk about food. Because I think a lot of foodies, if you will, try to make people feel bad if they're not doing the things that they think they ought to be doing. And I'm definitely not trying to do that. This is not about shame. It's about participating in a liberatory practice in a way that you are able, given where you are at times. And it's about people like me who have privilege, creating systems that allow those other people to flourish so that they actually can have more freedom and capacity to participate in the world in a way that's reflective of what they want to do rather than what they're economically limited to. So that's a little bit of a long answer, but I think it's probably enough for me to say right now.
No, and you also mentioned the necessity of small steps, that like when we look at the big picture, it's overwhelming, right? Like we look at the systems of injustice, we look at capitalism, we look at these billionaires that have enough money to completely change the world and don't want, and we can get stuck. But really, what's the next right step for, me as a family, as a person to take? Because you also talk about, what was the exact phrase? Because it had me thinking, agent specific and context specific. That, what's right for you at this point may not be right for me, given my personhood and my context, living in Flagstaff, Arizona, where we have a 2-month growing season, and we're isolated in some ways. We're 2.5 hours from Phoenix. And so you're thinking about, okay, what does it look like? For me is very different than Christopher, who's living in Los Angeles, which I appreciate, again, because it's easy to think, okay, I just got to adopt Christopher's model, and then I can live an anti-oppressive way. And that may be true, or it may be like, okay, who is God called Andrew to be? What's the next step I need to take for me and my family for health and for anti-oppressive living?
Exactly. And I think, the reason when I was thinking about how I describe the practice of soulful eating and Black veganism, the reason I thought about context specific is because I imagined like someone trying to ask my mom to do this when we were like struggling, right? When we were like have on food stamps, and like that would have been impossible.
Right.
But there's a way we can eat that could allow us to participate in the conversation, right? That could help us think about how we eat in a way that could move us closer to the liberation that we all wanted, even if we couldn't do everything. And so I didn't want to create this kind of moral hierarchy that I often encounter again in food justice circles. And I wanted to be open to people of all different backgrounds, and races and everything else. And so, there's a friend of mine, Rachel Brown, who's a professor in Canada. And one of the coolest things that I learned about was she had a group of Muslim students in her class. I want to say it was last year, her food and religion class, or in my book. And they really thought about, for them, adopting, kind of Black veganism within a Islamic framework. And they were like, what does it look like for us to eat in ways that are anti-oppressive, that are in alignment with our values? And they kind of made their own thing with it, which was like exactly what I would want. Like it was literally, I was like, that could have asked for anything better. I was like, I don't think I have the answer. I feel like I'm giving you an answer, but then people can add on and grow and shape that makes sense for them, because they were dealing with the same disconnect that I was feeling in California, because that's not where their people aren't Canadian. So that's not where they were from. And that kind of connection to food and identity and spirituality that really resonated with them. And so they were able to kind of find a way to shift it so it could be useful for them in their own spiritual religious practice.
That's awesome. Yeah. Because you give us sort of big themes, you talk about self-love, solidarity, and holistic interdependence as sort of the theological framework for which to deal with this. And then you do lay out 3 practices for us to move forward in, for soulful eating, seeking justice for food workers, and caring for the earth. And so I think if we can think about those aspects, then we can adopt an agent specific and context specific mode of being in the world.
Definitely, because I also know, like, again, a friend of mine I was just texting with a few minutes ago, like, she's diabetic. Like, her diet, she's type 1 diabetes, right? She's always been diabetic, and so she has to think differently about what she eats, right? Than many of us. And so, everybody can't do the same thing, but everybody can do something.
Yeah.
And before we move on, I want to make sure that I know I've said Black veganism a few times, so I'll just spend just a minute kind of explaining it.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure people are like, why are you?
No, that was my next question. Let's get to Black veganism and what does this mean for you? Yeah.
Yeah. So, it took me a long time, and I talk about that in the book. Like, I just didn't, once I came to this realization of, oh, wow, I don't want to be complicit in this system. I, for the most part, immediately became vegetarian, because I'm the kind of, my particular neurodivergence is such that I'm really committed to justice and ethics, which is why I have a degree in ethics. Yeah. And so, like, if I think something's morally right, I'm going to go to its logical conclusion. But I knew that I didn't have the skills and capacity to be vegan in a way that would allow me to eat it, that would allow me to still feel connected to my people and my community. And so I had to learn how to do it. And so I came up with the idea of Black veganism as a way to name the kind of consciousness raising process, and a way to make it context specific and agent specific, so people can recognize that this is a veganism that is what in academics we call an ontological. So it's more about an idea of being and becoming, rather than the practicality of not eating meat or participating in, not wearing leather or anything like that. That's a part of it, but it's about the process. And so really what I'm trying to do with Black veganism, the idea of Black veganism, is I wanted to name something different than traditional veganism, because often that's associated with, like, a kind of privileged, honestly, like, all the vegans I knew prior to me becoming vegan, broadly speaking, were like mostly white women. Yep. And it was always done about the animals. It was always about the animals and, like, polar bears and stuff like that, which is great. Again, my wife is a veterinary oncologist. Like, I am a fan of animals, but I did not become a vegan to have anything to do with animals. It has nothing. It has everything to do with people. Like, my veganism really is tied to my community. And so I wanted to make that upfront. I built on the work of Bell Hooks in her book Feminism for Everybody. She talks about this idea of consciousness raising. Now, they would have these consciousness raising groups in second wave feminism, and how they would grow to learn about how they were participating in patriarchy. And I was like, that's exactly what I want, right? For us to continue to eat and learn and reflect on how we're participating in the system and how we might change and challenge ourselves and continue to grow. Because I'm by no means perfect. I mean, I fly in airplanes. Like, I do things that in my head, I'm like, ideally, I wouldn't have to do this. And I don't, like, all the time. Sometimes I would do things online. I'm not going to Arizona to have this conversation with you face to face. We can use the miracle of technology.
Yep.
And so you find ways to go around it as best as you can. And so I want to have the consciousness raising. I want to make sure people understand that by calling it Black, I'm calling attention to the racialized realities of animals, and the ways in which the dehumanization of people and the thingification of animals is tied into how we eat animals. Yeah. Like, it relies on this logic that is deeply tied together. And I want to name that, so when I tell people I'm practicing Black veganism, people can ask me about it, so then I can talk about it, and I'm comfortable explaining this is why I eat this way. But I do it in a way that, and this is for me critical, most vegans I encountered were like, mean. I mean, they were literally just like, if you're not vegan, then you're evil, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't want to do that. I was like, that's not it. I'm like, no, man, like, it's a journey. Like, everybody's on their own journey. This is why I do this, because I see this and it's for me. Now, you eat how you eat, but ask yourself, are you eating in a way that's in alignment with your values? Right? And so then people are like, oh, yeah, I think I am. I'm like, well, what are your values? And when you start listing your values and you start thinking about how your food is, where it comes from and how it's made, you will probably find out it's not as much in alignment as you actually think.
No.
Right?
No.
And so this whole process, the book was written as a way for me to figure out how to eat in a way that's in alignment with my values, Andrew.
Wow.
That's literally what it was. That was this book. I
Yeah.
was like, man, I gotta figure this out because this is really important to me.
Yeah.
And I love to eat. And I love to cook. And so let me
Mm.
figure this out.
Right. Because, when you practice and, I didn't get your book knowing you were going to espouse Black veganism. And you start reading it and you start reading about soul food. And we have, regardless of who we are, we have pictures of what soul food is. And it's usually fried chicken or
Yeah.
lots of meat, or, if they're collard greens, they're cooked in bacon. You're practicing a different type of soul food. And so how does your soul food still pay homage to your ancestors without the typical fried chicken that we might associate with?
And that was hard for me initially, to feel like I was eating in a way that was disrespectful or disconnected from my community. I think a couple things helped. One, like I said, my grandpa grew up poor and didn't eat a lot of meat. And so while we ate meat, it wasn't the staple. I would say for us, honestly, the staple was beans and rice.
Right.
Like beans and rice was like the staple thing that we eat. If someone said I couldn't eat rice, I would have a hard time, because that's like, I eat rice probably almost every day. Because we were a rice family. That's where my ancestors from rice folk. And so what I do in the book is I show that our ideas of soul food has always evolved, that at its core, soul food is about the preservation and promotion of community.
Yeah.
And that's what it's always been about. Like when Black people, and Black women brought okra seeds and watermelon and those kind of seeds in their hair, they were trying to preserve a part of their identity as they were enslaved.
Yeah.
And so it's always been about this preservation and promotion of a way for us to feel connected to our past and also give a gift to the future generations. And so what that looks like has always and necessarily shifted over time.
Yeah.
It's never been the same, because we eat more meat now than we ever have.
Yeah.
And so the idea that my ancestors in West Africa ate fried chicken is just laughable. Like, that wasn't actually true. And so we have to, again, move past this idea that soul food is this static thing from the 1930s to 1960s, right? America, because it's not. It's always evolved, and it will continue to evolve. And so what I'm trying to do when I talk about soul food is recognizing that it's porous, and that it is a part of a broader conversation. Again, it's always about, and I believe that to preserve and promote my community now is to opt out of systems that marginalize and oppress us. And so it's do the things and eat in ways that uplift. And so for me, that is Black veganism. And to be fair, Andrew, I had to learn how to cook in ways that were still tasted like home. And that's why, each chapter of the book ends with recipes, because I want people to know, like, this was done through practice. Like, this wasn't just this theoretical exercise, man. Like, I was like, I need to figure out, like, when I do these book talks, I did one at the University of California, Irvine, and there's this older Black woman that came there, and I see her and so what happens is when I do it, if everything works out, I'm able to actually serve the recipes from each of the chapters to the people so they can eat while I'm doing the talk. That's always my ideal. So that way it's kind of an experiential thing.
For sure.
So this woman, she plates the food and she puts everything in these little cups. And I'm just like, wow, that's kind of weird. Why she got it all individually set aside? And so she's tasting all of them individually. And then when I finish, she's like, you know something? She's like, I want to tell you. She's like, I'm from Hammond, Louisiana. And I know your people because my dad's from Hammond, Louisiana.
Okay.
And so I was like, wow. So there's this woman there who knows my people. And she was like, I didn't want to believe what you were saying. She's like, because the way I grew up eating is tied to how I understand myself as a Southerner, as a Black person, as a Black woman. She's like, but I'm eating these things and it reminds me of the things I ate growing up. It reminds me of that community and that culture. And her compliment, her praise of my recipes, honestly, I was over the moon. Like, it was more than anything anybody else could say, because I was like, I have done the thing I set out to do. I
Right.
have this old Black woman who
Yeah.
says my food tastes like it's supposed to taste for my community. I was like, all right, I think I've cracked the code now. I feel good about where things are.
No, that's awesome. Yeah. Um, and also your book, your book is primarily geared towards your community, but you have a little excursus for the white community, and so most of my listeners are white Christian, probably more evangelical conservative, and so how does this relate to white evangelical or white Christian mainline, wherever you are on the spectrum? But for the white audience, how does this factor for white people?
Yeah, no, I think that, so part of the reason that I wrote that section is in part because my father's ancestry, like I said, is from Hammond, Louisiana, but his ancestors are Spanish.
Hmm.
And so my great grandfather or my grandfather is white. I mean, he's white. He'd be classified as white.
Yeah.
He saw himself as Spanish, but he's white, from Spain, from the Basque region of Spain. And so I always had this awareness that I am Black, but that's not the entirety of who I am,
Mm-hmm.
and that my relationship is complicated because my grandpa and my grandpa's family, like, they were overseers. Like, they were the ones who were like, but they were the ones running the plantation, like, over my mom's side of the family, who were the workers on the plantation, right?
Right.
And so I have this kind of that complexity is within me, right? Is what I want to
Yeah.
say. And I think it's within all of us.
Yeah.
And so for me, I wrote that section to recognize that for me to heal and think about that part, it was much more about what I call an inward turn. It is about tending to the parts of me that were reactive to learning about my complicity in systems of oppression, that were reactive to learning about and being challenged by the theology of, that I was developing, this kind of theological anthropology of what it means to see humans as create an image of God, and what does that look like, to not participate in sin. And so for me, like, the groundedness of my theology in the book really emerges out of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And for me, I see that parable as, I understand sin to be the failure to bother to love.
Yeah.
And that's taken from Jim Keenan, who's this Roman Catholic priest. And I think that's so evident in that story, where you have the priest and the Levite, right? You have the religious people who literally failed to bother to take the time to do the loving thing, right? They can do it. They have that, and they opt not to. But then the person who you least expect actually takes the time. The person bothers to see the dignity, to see the self-worth, to see the image of God, right, in the person that was beat up, that needed to be taken care of. And so for me, what the invitation is for people who are not people of color is to not fail to bother to love, to recognize that your actions impact more than just you, and impact broader communities. And what does it look like to eat in a way that not only is in alignment with your values, but to take seriously the reality of your call to love your neighbor, like the greatest commandment, to love God and love neighbor as you love yourself. And that self-love part, tend to the stuff that comes up, right? Don't suppress your feelings.
Right.
Don't pretend they're not there. Actually compassionately tend to them like you would your best friend talking to you. And that gives you the space to actually connect with others.
Yeah.
And so, I'm a liberationist. I come from a liberation perspective, but I have found that I'm able to have good conversations with people who are conservative, because I think there's a lot more we have in common. If we're not talking about politics, we can usually get along.
No, for sure. Right. Because it is, we're grounded in that, call to love ourselves, and then you ask us to move into solidarity.
Yep.
And then that holistic interdependence with all of creation, human and non-human. And, and that's, those three themes, I think are worth meditating on. And then how do we eat in alignment with those values? And so listeners, I hope you've been challenged by Christopher, and can reflect to just, okay, what does eating look like given who we believe Jesus to be in the rule and reign of his kingdom? and it's a question I'm wrestling with, and I'm far from perfect. Like our eating habits are not in alignment, with that, like we buy our meats from Sam's and, Kroger right now, like, and my wife and I probably need to wrestle through. And we've had some conversations of like, okay, I've been privileged to have some amazing conversations with people on this podcast. And so like, okay, what needs to change for me? Like, how does this podcast more than just an intellectual fun exercise, but a way of being in the world that is in alignment with what I'm saying on this podcast? And it's a wrestling I'm constantly doing and trying to figure out, and so listeners, I hope, you're not guilted by this podcast, but that it's again, an invitation to think differently. And I think Christopher's done that for us today.
And I would say, Andrew, it's an invitation for you to be compassionate towards yourself,
Right.
recognizing it's a process.
Yeah.
Right. Like I would encourage you, don't jump into this with 2 feet and just start doing something, because you need to learn what it's going to look like for you and for your community and for your family. And to think critically about it, right?
Yeah.
Like how to feed your family, where to get your food, how to cook. It's learning. It's a whole new way of thinking and being and doing. But my experience is that as you take those steps, right, it gets easier and easier and easier as you continue to grow. And I would argue it's growing towards God. It's growing towards love and growing towards this way of being in the world that's closer approximation of what God love calls us to be into the world. And so be gentle with yourself, and yet encourage yourself to continue to grow and sit in that tension. And I believe that's what that is a way for us to think about moving forward.
Yeah. Awesome. It's a question I love to ask all of my guests. So what's the story you want the church to tell?
Oh, wow. I think so. I'm an ordained Methodist pastor. I've been pastoring churches, been an ordained person for about 14 years now. And when I think about the answer to this question, it's informed by my experience in the congregation as a clergy person. And I would love the church to tell a story of belonging, right? And I think belonging is deeper than including. I think that a lot of times we can tell people that they're included and that they're invited to this space, but they don't feel like they belong, right? When you cultivate a spirit of belonging, you create a space where people don't necessarily feel like they have to fit in to know that they belong, right? They can come there and know they can be themselves, and yet there's just something there that holds it together, that allows us to be connected to each other. And that's what I want the message of the church to be to the world is that we want to be a place where all people feel like they belong, regardless of what they're bringing to the table, right? Regardless of their identity or their ability, that they feel as though, that they belong. And that is, I believe Jesus is always challenging us to expand the table, to use a metaphor of the biggest table, right? Like it's always about like when Jesus when he gets to the when he goes to Nazareth and he reads Isaiah's scroll and he's giving his first sermon, and the people are like, yeah, that's great. And then he's like, but I want to include more people than just our community. I want to include they're like, wait. We need to include the Gentiles. We need to include these other people. It needs to be about us. And Jesus is like, no, we need to expand the table. And that's where we meet resistance by so many people, is the refusal to expand and to allow other people to participate and be with us. And so let us continue to expand the table so it can actually become the biggest table, right? Sure. Reflective of the title of your podcast.
Yeah. No, I love that. Like belonging is different than inclusion. And that's something to think through. And if you're a leader of a church, or whether you just attend a church, including somebody is very different than belonging. And so what does that mean for you and your community? It's a great word. And so some fun questions to wrap up about food. What's one food you refuse to eat?
Pudding.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It just I have texture issues. It's just weird.
Okay.
I can make myself eat banana pudding, but I don't really want to. Like I'm just like I don't really like it. No.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. What's on the other end of the spectrum? What's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
Olive oil from Tuscany
Okay.
on just straight fresh baked bread.
Yeah.
It was the first time I realized what olives are supposed to taste like.
Okay.
I was like, oh, this is an olive. I was
Yeah.
like, oh, this is what olive oil tastes like when it's actually fresh pressed. It
Yeah.
blew my mind. It blew my
Okay.
mind.
Was that in Tuscany? Like was
Yeah,
okay.
I was doing work. Did some work for the Catholic Church, and I was in Rome, and I was in Assisi, and then I
Nice.
did some other. I'm up there. I might as well go visit some farms and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it was pretty cool.
That's awesome. And then finally, there's a conversation among chefs about last meals, as in if you knew you had one last meal to enjoy, what would be on your table? And so for Christopher, if you knew you had one last meal, what would be on your table?
Oh man. Probably it's tough. This is a very difficult question. And because it's changed over time. I think my instincts, I have to cheat. I'm sorry. My instincts are to say what I would choose ultimately would be beans and rice and cornbread
Hmm.
because that's what always sounds good. I can eat that and it always feels like it gives me a sense of connection to myself. But my favorite thing right now that I've loved to cook and make and probably want to make for dinner is pizza.
Okay. Yeah.
And this is Italy. My wife loves Italy. We've been twice, and like it has
Nice.
infected my soul as well. And so, um, I love cooking my own pizza, my own dough,
Hmm.
my own ingredients, and it just tastes. It tastes so good. Again, yeah.
Nice.
Once I was in, people think idea about Tuscany. They don't recognize these are farmers. And when you
Yeah.
go meet them, and they just you actually eat some of that actual rural folks' food. It changes everything for you.
Yep.
It did for me. It changed me.
Okay. So what does a pizza look like? As a vegan, what does pizza? What do you put on your pizza?
Yeah, I make a vegan basil pesto.
Okay.
This is almond. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
that hard. It's
No.
easy to make pesto. It's vegan, and then grilled vegetables. So we usually peppers, two different kinds of bell pepper, onion, mushroom, and I do like field roast if I'm gonna put some meat on there or what I
Okay.
call meat. Right?
Yeah.
Field roast vegan sausage is. I absolutely love it. Like
Nice.
it's delicious. So I don't eat
Okay.
a ton of vegan meat, but I do put that on there.
Yeah. And do you have a pizza oven at home or?
Actually, I have a really good gas oven
Okay.
that works perfectly. I use a pizza screen,
Yep.
and the key is always getting. You either gotta make your own dough or you gotta
Yep.
go get fresh dough. Like
Yep.
that's the key. If you do that, then you're fine.
Yep. No, we love pizza night at our house. We use a baking steel,
Oh,
so
okay.
and get that thing smoking hot, and we get a pretty decent crust
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
way.
so I have my oven is a convection, and
Yeah.
so like it just a fan in there really, and with that pizza screen, it allows the crust to get crispy without
Yeah.
getting overly burnt.
Mm-hmm.
Put it in the middle. I mean, it's amazing.
No, it
So
is. Yep. Homemade pizza. I could eat homemade pizza and never feel bad. Whereas if I eat, takeout pizza, a couple slices, and it's like, oh, all right,
yeah,
I'm gonna
exactly.
regret that.
Yeah, and I think I can imagine. I know. I think you said you have kids, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a 5-year-old, and so again, pizza's always like it's easy. He
Yep.
loves it. He loves to help make it,
Yep.
and so my diet is definitely influenced by my child. I'll say
For
that.
sure. Yep. Awesome. Well, Christopher, this has been a delight. I really appreciate your challenge, your invitation, but also your pastoral heart. And if people are interested in learning more about you, following your work, where could they find you?
So my website is drchristophercarter.com. You can find all my work and research and stuff there.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to learn more about the things I do on the more religious spectrum, I work at the Loft. So that's at theloftla.org. And lastly, I host a progressive Christian podcast that
Okay.
is more about like faith politics, and pop culture. And
Nice.
so we've been pretty busy with lots of things happening over there as well. So that's kind of where I am right now. And so you can find me on social media, find me
Yep.
on that stuff. And yeah,
And what was the name of your podcast again?
it's called the Progressive Christians Podcast.
Okay, gotcha. Nice. Awesome.
Just
And we'll make
really straightforward. I'm
really
like, this
straightforward.
is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Yep. And we'll make sure to include all those in the show notes. And so again, thanks so much, Christopher, for being a guest on this podcast. Really appreciate your time. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.